Hey guys, this is Thatcher, and today we're going to be going over how I go about scanning film. In part 2 of this video, we'll be covering how I do the post-production, converting the scans into positive images. So let's start off. I've already got my gloves on, and I'm going to choose a shot out of this set to scan. All right, and we're going to go ahead and put this in the frame. All right, and once that's in there and reasonably aligned, we're going to go ahead and dust it off here. Now, I personally have the Plustek 8200 eye scanner, which we can see over here. And we're going to go ahead and load our film into there. Next up, we have Vuescan. So I do all of my scanning in Vuescan because it offers this really useful functionality that we can write the scans to DNG. We're going to be using DNG because we can decode those later in the scanner's native sensor RGB format, right? So we can actually bypass any color management using this approach. So let's go through the settings that I use in Vuescan. So first off, we're going to be using the format of 48-bit RGB. Optionally, if you had use of the infrared channel, which kind of highlights the dust a bit more, you could do that one, but I'm going to be using 48 RGB. Next up, for scan resolution, this one's important. I set that to the highest the scanner offers. I've run resolution chart tests on the scanner, and truthfully, it can only really resolve about 3600 dpi worth of resolution. However, if you set it to 3600 dpi in Vuescan, you may run into grain aliasing artifacts. So as a result, I noticed that I get the smoothest grain when I use 7200 dpi. So we're going to go ahead and use that. We're going to turn all this stuff off, autosave on the scan. And the most important thing, actually I have this in a preset here that I have hidden under F1. So you can save your options here. So I have an initial exposure and a long exposure. So in my initial exposure, I'm going to have lock exposure checked, and I'm going to set the exposure to 1. The number here seems to represent a duration. So we have 1 unit of exposure. And then I'm going to go ahead and save these somewhere. Let me go ahead and set that up right now. All right. So in this case, we're going to be saving to this demo folder, and we'll have an exposure of 1. I'm going to go ahead and save these options to overwrite my usual presets so that I don't lose them later. Every time I save to a new folder, I'm going to be changing the directory, and I'll be updating the settings. Next up, let's check out the other settings. I usually keep the crop at the default maximum. Don't change anything there. Infrared, I don't infrared clean or anything. I'm not even sure if it uses any of these settings if you record to a raw format. So I've set all this stuff to manual. These curve settings here give you a straight line curve. And I just lied to it and said that it's, a slide film so that we can encourage it to not do anything. Ultimately, the trick is that we check this raw file box and that we record raw DNG format. We check out the rest of the preferences. Yeah, none of this stuff seems relevant. So that's a quick look at my settings. Next thing we're going to do, we're going to go ahead and hit scan. And we're going to have to wait about a minute for this thing to complete. All right, so the first scan is done. You can see that I've done a pretty terrible job in terms of dusting it. The reality is that normally I scan my film immediately after it comes back from the lab. So I take out the sleeve that it comes in, and I cut it all up and whatnot. And these negatives have been in and out of the sleeve a few times. So usually my results aren't maybe this hairy. The next thing we're going to do here is first we're going to check, and we're going to see, okay, the DNG was written. So we're going to go ahead and do a second exposure. The second exposure is going to be at an RGB exposure of 4. I found that with this scanner, if you set the exposure beyond 4, it seems to give no improvement in terms of signal to noise ratio or anything. So we're going to be using these 2 scans to reconstruct the highlights later and make sure that the scanner's noise floor is affecting the image as little as possible. One thing that's really important is that we have to make sure not to touch the scanner or anything at all when we switch from one exposure to the other, because that will result in the scans not being properly aligned when we want to combine the two into a stitch later. So I just set that to 4. I'm going to go ahead and save my options as the long exposure. That way, if I'm scanning more of the roll, I just have to switch between F1 and F2, and I can alternate exposures and go shot by shot and so on. So let's go ahead and scan this again using the longer exposure. I'm going to use Command N to start a new exposure. All right, and we can see over here that we have our 2 scans. I really should have renamed the second one to high. So that's usually in my preset. So I'm going to go ahead and rename that right now so that I don't make this mistake again in the future. And this preset, we should have the word high over here. Right, so I'm going to go ahead and save those options in the other preset and the long exposures. Boom. So that way when it does the exposures, it'll kind of like do this alternating where the number represents what frame you're on and high and low represent which exposure is which. So before we're done, I do want to make sure that I capture one more thing, which is going to be a scan from the end of the roll. So let me go ahead and take this out and swap it out with a different piece of film. I'm going to go ahead and try to dust this off again because of that piece of lint that was on the shot the whole time. Probably don't want to store these things dusty, you know. And let's just grab this bit from the end of the roll. At the end of the roll, you always have one part of the film that is like super overexposed because that's the part that was out when you loaded it into the camera. And then you've got the parts that were, you know, never exposed to the light at all. So I like to slice it off so that we've got, you know, centimeter, maybe a bit more of the overexposed high density part. And then we've got the D-min next to it. And then beyond it, right here, we're going to have the completely transparent aspect, the invisible film, so to speak. I'll show you how that works here. So I'm going to go ahead and drop that into my frame. And you can see here that I've been strategic. So frame 1, 2, 3, right? I've got a little bit of clear, I've got some D max, and I've got some D min. So we're going to make sure to throw that into the scanner. And we'll go ahead and repeat our 2 scans again. So I'm just going to hit F1 now that we've kind of set up that preset, Command N, and it will go ahead and scan that. We can see we've done a little bit better of a job keeping this dust free. I'm going to go ahead and scan it again. I hit F2 to switch to the high exposure. So that's the RGB exposure of 4. And we're going to hit Command N again. One other thing I'd like to highlight is that currently I am on Vuescan 9.8.28. There have recently been other Vuescan updates that I did try one out, and it had some issues with this lock exposure mode. So, you know, you might have to like roll back or maybe wait until they've bug fixed that out in order to really make use of that. One other thing that you can already see is that on the left, sometimes the high exposure will end up clipping or like having this weird like green artifact if it's overexposed a little too far. I've tried to set up these exposures so that for any material that's not like completely invisible, you don't really get this kind of artifact, at least on my scanner. But that is something that you have to play with, right? Because sometimes these green outlines and fringes are going to make it so that it's very difficult to combine these 2 exposures in post. All right, we can see here we have now a frame 1 and a frame 1 of the high and low exposures. So that finishes what we're going to be doing in Vuescan. For the rest of this video, I'm going to show you how we go from these DNGs to a very lightly pre-processed EXR. So we're going to combine these exposures together and then output an EXR that represents transmittance. Okay, so we finished scanning, the gloves are off, and we're going to go into Fusion Studio, where I'm going to pull in the DNG files, and we're going to combine them together, these 2 different exposures. We're going to combine them into an EXR file that represents transmittance. And we're going to go ahead and pull in both of these here. So we can see that we've got essentially these 2 frames. One of them is this kind of scan, and the other one is the low exposure. I'm going to go ahead and change the layout to the mid-flow because I find it a little bit easier to work with. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and decode the DNGs as BMD/linear. So we're going to go over to this format page here. Color space, we're going to set that to BMD, and we're going to set that to linear, and we're going to have to repeat the process for the low scan. The way Blackmagic Design software works with DNG files is that if you were to decode to the color space, so to speak, of Blackmagic Design, or in Fusion Studio it's called BMD, what it gives you is it gives you the sensor native RGB values, but they've been white balanced. So they've been scaled up and down a little bit. There have been no matrices applied. And in my own testing, I have found that this is equivalent to using DC raw to extract the native RGB values from that sensor. I will say that over the course of this tutorial, we're going to be using a lot of tools that I've written. Now, fortunately for you, all my tools are free on GitHub. I will have my GitHub linked in the description below. You might have to install some DCTLs and fuses in order to follow this pipeline exactly. That being said, let's get on with it. So the first tool we're going to be using is called HDR blending. So the idea with HDR blending is that we're going to be looking at the clipping point of one of the two stills, generally the higher exposure, which is going to clip earlier, right? We're going to look at that clipping point, and we're going to replace everything that's clipped in each of the channels with unclipped parts, in the highlights of the other exposure. That's the idea. But what this tool expects is that both of your inputs have been already normalized to the same level. So there is something of a little bit of a challenge here in which we have to choose the appropriate exposure level. So I'm going to use my tool called linear exposure. This is the same as color gain, except it reports it in stops instead of having to type in values like that. So let me go ahead and turn on the waveform here. And sometimes, because these scans are so large, it really helps to lower the sampling of the waveform. All right, and I'll also set it to RGB. So we can definitely see that in our brighter exposure, the red channel is clipped, right? And one thing that's kind of convenient about these scanners is that the DNGs are already scaled so that the clipping point is 1.0. All right, and if we look at the lower exposure, we can see that this red channel is much lower, but it is not clipped, right? So let's go ahead. We're gonna increase the exposure of this one on the right so that it matches the same level as over here. So we're just gonna ride this up until we see that the waveforms match. And sometimes you have to go in here and play with the rightmost digits. Right now I'm looking at this blob here, right? And I'm seeing that it looks like it's in about the same spot, right? There will, of course, be a noise difference, so you kind of have to align the center of one mass with the other. And the way we'll really know is if we can switch between these two on the left and the waveform overall does not move. Now, I'm obviously seeing that I am seeing some movement, so I think I have to move it up just a touch more, maybe. Let's try that. So we've got this, we've got this. So this feels like the two line up very well. We can see the blue channels like not even moving at all. So once we've got these two exposures matched pretty well, what we want to do is we want to take our high exposure, which has clipped highlights, right? And I'm going to go ahead and make that the background. I'm going to hit Command T to kind of swap these. And we're going to be taking the everything that's above 1.0 in the foreground. And you know what? I'm going to give it like a stop of space. So we're going to say everything that's above, let's say 0.8, and everything, and I'll start feathering it in starting at about 0.4. Sometimes it improves the results a little bit if you use a touch of blur, but we will not be doing that today. All right. So now we can see the output of the HDR blending node. We can see that we have this pretty clean shadow floor, and we can see that we have highlights that go all the way up here, right? So as a result, we have effectively recovered our highlights in this scan, right? Next thing we're going to do is we're going to go to the following scan. So this is the scan of the end of the film strip, right? And we can see that over here on the right, if we look at the code value in the bottom left, we can see that we have, like a 3.6-ish code value, right? So I want to normalize this scan so that it represents transmittance. So transmittance means that this white area on the left should correspond to 111 as the code value. So the way I'm going to do that is I'm just going to do I'll do a little blur over here. We're not actually going to be like using this blur much, but this way we can kind of average together many samples over here, right? And I'm going to go ahead and we're going to do a color gain. We've got color gain, and we're going to divide each of the channels by this white value on the left. So I'm going to type in 1.0 divided by 3.59306. This one's going to be 1.0 divided by 3.59851. The next one is going to be 1.0 divided by 3.62181. All right. So then if we look at the color gain node here, if we look at the waveform right now, we can see that this left-hand side now sits at 100, right? So that means that it represents transmittance, being the proportion of photons that made it through this piece of film, right? Okay, so we're back to the first frame that we scanned, and we're gonna go ahead and make a saver, and we will go ahead and save this EXR somewhere on my computer. I'm not very creative, so I'm gonna call it scan large. And I like to put a little underscore there so that the numbers show up after that underscore. And we'll save that like that. And if you want, you can change the compression methodology. So wavelet, for example, or DWA are usually pretty small. And I'm going to go ahead and do float 16 because truthfully, I'm not sure it's worth wasting all my space with float 32s. Next up, I'm also going to do a little resize. Well, actually, what we'll do is we'll do a scale. And I'll scale down a small version by maybe a factor of 2. So we'll do a 0.5, say, and then we'll go ahead and save a small scan as well. This is useful because sometimes large scans are pretty intensive, and sometimes it makes sense to just color grade based off of the small scan. That way your computer's a little more responsive and whatnot. So we've got that. We've set our render frames to frame 0 and 1. I'm going to go ahead and click render. So there we have it. We now have these 4 files representing our scans for these 2 frames. So that's all for this video. In the next video, I'm going to show you the post-processing pipeline to make it so that we can take these negatives and turn them into appealing positives.